A few weeks ago, I was at a Halloween party and met this girl in a picture-perfect Ramona Flowers costume. She had the blue hair, the cute skirt and tights, and most importantly, that iconic star bag. Naturally, we started talking about the new Scott Pilgrim show that, at the time, was coming out soon. And we both agreed on a cautious optimism. Namely, we hoped that it would be more true to the graphic novels than the movie had been, but honestly, we were both just happy for more Scott Pilgrim content. Fast forward a month later, and Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is here, and it doesn't disappoint. It blends many of the fan-favorite elements of both the movie, with a complete return of the cast, and the graphic novels by masterfully bringing Brian Lee O'Malley's iconic style to life. In its own right, it's a feast for all the senses, with bombastic visuals, stellar music, just okay voice acting, but let's give them a break since lots of the cast aren't trained voice actors, and a fascinating story that, for me, really spoke to what I thought was so special about Scott Pilgrim. But the fact of the matter is that Takes Off is the youngest sibling of the series. It exists in a world where it's preceded by both a beloved graphic novel series and arguably an even more beloved movie. As of recording, which is only a few days after release, the show is being favorably received for the most part, but with the caveat of, but the movie did, insert thing here, better. Viewers have also been noting confusion of how exactly Takes Off fits with the series we all know and love, because it's not really a sequel to the movie or even an adaptation of the graphic novels. It's something very original that is in a larger metatextual conversation with its own predecessors and its own Scott Pilgrimness. Which got me thinking about the 3 installments of what I'm going to call the Scott Pilgrim universe. That being Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Scott Pilgrim, the series, and now Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. I want to look at how each of these installments influence each other and subsequently the viewer experience. Naturally, there's going to be tons of spoilers for all 3 pieces, so skip to certain chapters in the video, or even better, if you've got time, go binge watch or read or do whatever you need to do before continuing to watch. All right, first up, let's start with the one that everyone's most familiar with. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a movie directed by Edgar Wright, starring Michael Cera as Scott Pilgrim, a 22-year-old guy in Toronto kind of floundering in life. That is, until he meets Ramona Flowers, age unknown, and decides to start a relationship with her, despite already kinda sorta dating a high schooler named Knives Chow. However, to date Ramona, he has to fight...
Defeat your 7 evil exes?
This movie is supremely well-loved, largely due to Wright's editing style. It's lauded for its unique visuals that retain a comic book feel even in movie format, and its numerous references to video games and just general nerd culture. It's a kind of movie that feels safe for a specific type of person, one that touts that you don't have to be the typical leading man to be the hero. You can look like Michael Cera, and be a badass fighter and have cool friends and attain the power of love. So, like I said, this is probably the version of Scott Pilgrim that you and most other people are familiar with, which is why we're calling it the first installment of the SPU. This is what is culturally recognized as baseline Scott, even if comic Scott is really the true original. Now, I have no beef with people that love this movie. I went to film school and studied games. Geeks of all stripes love this movie. But as someone who identifies more with Ramona or Kim than Scott, it's always kind of felt like Scott gets off easy. He has an emotional journey, he apologizes for his mistakes and befriends the demons within him, but in the end, has Scott really grown from the same floundering guy he was at the beginning of the movie, just with a different girlfriend? He dies and suddenly just fast tracks into being not a jerk. Like, this Scott doesn't need the power of self-respect, he places his own needs above others all the time. He needs the power of understanding others. In the years since the movie came out, more and more people agree that while this movie is wonderful, Scott is not. He's an incredibly flawed protagonist, and while the movie may not have had enough time to really explore that, the 6-volume graphic novel series does. Scott Pilgrim is a graphic novel series about a 23-year-old named Scott, floundering in life as he recovers from a broken heart via his ex-girlfriend, Envy Adams, pop star sensation. He meets Ramona Flowers, despite the fact that he's been kinda sorta seeing Knives Chow, and instantly falls in love. However, he must defeat Ramona's 7 evil exes over the course of the next year in order to be with her. He does, but these fights bring up the darkness of Ramona's past and her constant need to move from one thing to the next when things get too hard. Scott's own past comes up as his own exes reveal that Scott isn't the good guy he thinks he is, and constantly misremembers the shitty things he did to paint himself as a hero. They both are the kind of people to run away from their problems, Ramona physically and Scott mentally, and not take responsibility for their actions or even really acknowledge the harm it does to those around them. But through fighting the exes and Scott's past catching up with him too, they both learn that baggage is part of being a person. You have to confront it and carry it with you, but having someone else to take the weight makes it less scary, even if it means opening up. As long as I'm giving my personal opinions, I cannot recommend the series enough, especially if you're a young 20-something feeling kind of lost in life and maybe a bit lonely. There's an authenticness to it. Despite the fact that, vegans have superpowers and Ramona can somehow rollerblade in the middle of a Canadian winter. Besides that, there's just a lot of emotional rawness that the movie, just by nature of the medium, didn't have time to cover. The movie just also had a very different focus. Within the context of the series, the movie is really about Scott's hero fantasy, or how he sees himself. He is the good guy. He doesn't need to confront the consequences of his actions as deeply because he's so clearly the protagonist. And within this type of narrative, the audience can trust that he's the guy to root for, even with his flaws. But the books are different. Scott is the main character, but the people around him and his relationships to them are really the core. If the movie is more of an action story, the comics are definitely more of a character story. So part of deconstructing the relationship between the movie and the book is seeing how they differ, right? Now, obviously, when you're adapting 6 graphic novels into a movie, you need to make a lot of changes. You need to make a lot of cuts. You only have so much time. But there's one scene that really shows kind of the different values that went into how the movie is constructed versus how the books are constructed. It's a scene where after Scott and Ramona's first date, they start making out in her room. In the movie, Ramona stops the makeout session and says, "I don't want to have sex with you right now," which confuses Scott a little bit, but he quickly embraces it. However, in the comics, they start making out, but Scott gets hesitant. He's not super sure what he wants. And Ramona sees him being hesitant and says that she changed her mind, which gives Scott the space to come right out and say he didn't feel comfortable sleeping with her right then. With movie Scott, this moment becomes about him being a good guy and respecting what Ramona wants. It's a quick way to show him as having a virtuous quality. With book Scott, this is a moment about he and Ramona's relationship, where they are both paying attention to what the other one wants and needs in that moment. Scott's joke the next morning of, "Can this not be a one-night stand? For one thing, I didn't get any," hits really differently depending on who stopped the night before. Y'all, please just go read the books. They're so good. They're so good. So, now we've got the movie and the books established. The movie is a shorter form medium focusing on Scott as a protagonist, while the books are a longer, deeper look into the emotional complexity of Scott's relationships. So, how does Takes Off fit into all this? Back at that Halloween party, the Ramona that I met and I were talking about how we were both just hoping that the show would be truer to the novels, because we both assumed Takes Off would be an adaptation. That would make sense, they're the same artistic style. But, and I'm shockingly happy to report, we were both very wrong. Bear with me on a tangent, but because I'm pretty sure the Venn diagram of people who are interested enough in Scott Pilgrim to watch YouTube essays on it and Evangelion fans is probably pretty close to a circle, have you seen the Eva movies? I promise we'll circle back to Scott Pilgrim, but quick Evangelion lesson. There's 3 big parts to Evangelion as well. There's the main show, which ran out of budget at the end and had to improvise an ending. Then there's End of Evangelion, which is a movie that's the true ending to the series. And then the series of Rebuild of Evangelion movies, which are this alternate timeline where, spoiler alert, everyone gets their happy endings. Evangelion is a similarly fervent cult classic to Scott Pilgrim, if not more fervent. But the first 2 endings are pretty difficult to swallow. They're poignant in their own rights, but Rebuild has catharsis in that it feels like a satisfying conclusion for the characters that doesn't leave you asking, okay, well then what? Considering who was behind the series, I'm fairly sure that the creators behind Takes Off were looking at the Rebuild movies and thinking, oh, yeah, that's a really good way to adapt this. Takes Off is very similar in concept to its predecessors. The first episode starts off just like the movie and the books. It's beat for beat very similar, with a few notable differences, like Wallace being weirdly fed up with Scott's mooching.
When are you getting your own place?
Isn't this my place?
No, I let you crash here one time and you never left.
That's not how I remember it.
It's everything that you'd expect out of Scott Pilgrim until Scott starts fighting the first evil ex, Matthew Patel, and loses. Scott Pilgrim is dead by episode 2. And the fascinating consequence of this is that by taking Scott out of the equation, the story has to focus on the world, namely on Ramona. If the movie is entirely Scott and the series is Scott Pilgrim and the world, then Takes Off is really where the world gets to shine. As you might have guessed, Scott isn't really dead. He was kidnapped during the fight, and Ramona is running around for weeks trying to figure out what happened to this guy that she went on one date with but had such brilliant sparks with. Now, Ramona's portrayal in the movie is very different than Scott's. She became the quintessential manic pixie dream girl in pop culture. Now, the books do a lot to build her up as a three-dimensional character, but it's kind of inherent to the narrative of all of these exes fighting over her that her role in the story is kind of a prize to be won. Once Matthew wins the fight, but Ramona still rejects him, the League realizes that they can't just fight their way back into being with Ramona, so they disband and leave to do their own things. But they're all still pretty suspicious, so Ramona tracks them all down to see if any of them kidnap Scott. And importantly, beautifully, this forces Ramona to confront how her running away hurt all of them. And most importantly, apologize for what she did to them. These cardboard cutout bad guys suddenly turn into young adults just trying to move on from the hurt they'd been nursing for years and focus on something besides their big titty goth ex. Several find new loves and new ventures that haven't been explored in the previous stories. Heck, Matthew Patel is actually a really fun character when he doesn't get KO'd within 5 minutes. Scott's own exes, Knives and Envy, also have more room to breathe because Scott isn't the only focus anymore. It turns out that Knives is a really good musician. And Envy, well, okay, actually, she was criminally underused in Takes Off compared to the books, but she's a fun side villain for Ramona. Takes Off really assumes you've seen the movie, if not read the novels. The whole premise is that this story specifically isn't Scott Pilgrim versus the world, and even has a whole episode where the characters get roped into making a movie where Scott won the fight against Matthew, directed by Edgar Wrong. Heck, the whole shock factor of Scott dying in the second episode relies on you assuming you know this story. Alongside the meta implications of this movie and this series sharing the same voice cast, huge chunks of the marketing relied on the fact that fans of the movie would come back to see the cast reunited, even though, understandably, they all sound like they're in their 40s. In universe, this is explained as in one timeline, things do play out as they do in regular Scott Pilgrim. Scott fights the evil exes, Ramona and Scott to get together, and then they got married. But their bad habits came back, and they end up divorcing, running away from their problems. Future Scott, hurt and alone, paints himself as the good guy, as he's wont to do, and Ramona as a villain. And he decides to save his past self by kidnapping his past self to convince him to never get together with Ramona in the first place. What's wild about this is that it's kind of the nastiest Scott has ever looked. He can kind of get away with his slacker, dumb behavior as a 23-year-old, but crashing in Wallace's house with no job and a shitty band doesn't look as good in middle age. And him pointing the finger at his ex and not thinking about what he did wrong looks even more pathetic as an adult. Also, Ramona travels back in the past to give young Neil the script of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which she wrote, so that her and Scott's love story is recorded somewhere, just in case old Scott's plan actually works. No, it doesn't make any sense, and Ramona is the first to admit that.
Old me would convince this me that young you was bad news, and he'd send me back home, and we'd break up, and then one day I'd be at my local Cineplex and see a preview for a movie about myself.
Okay, the plan may have been misguided.
The point is that even in the face of this uncertain future, Scott and Ramona see older versions of themselves with their flaws in full force and choose to be better. Ramona chooses to embrace her good and bad, mess and all, and choose love. Scott actually doesn't learn all that much in the end because he's just at the beginning of this story. Ramona went on a whole journey and Scott was just kind of bumming with old Scott for a little bit. I hope old Scott learns and finds happiness with old Ramona, who seemed willing to take him back. But at least current Scott has now seen just how dark he can become and knows how to keep from going down that path. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is hugely fan servicey. Its very core depends on its audience knowing and loving these characters already, though if it's the first Scott Pilgrim media you've seen, I would love to hear your perspective in the comments below. But alongside leaning into that fan service, Takes Off took a huge gamble of making an entirely different story to its predecessors and, ironically, take the Scott Pilgrim out of Scott Pilgrim so that the story could stand on its own 2 feet. In my opinion, it worked. As Scott and Ramona start their new life together, ready for the future ahead, they don't just open a subspace door into the unknown. They open a door that leads to each other and their friends and full life together. It's a cathartic ending that feels more complete than the movie and the books. In the Scott Pilgrim universe, it makes a lovely end cap to the story, both in its own right and as a series. Now, with the teased cliffhanger, let's see if it stays that way.
Oh no!
Hello again, friend of a friend. I knew you when our common goal was waiting for the world to end. Now that the truth is just a rule that you can bend, you crack the whip, shape shift and trick the past again. I'll send you my love on a wire, lift you up every time.